Big Shaq was kicked out like a shadow but came back like a storm. They mocked Big Shaq on camera, erased him with policy, and thought the story ended there. But Big Shaq doesn't forget. And Big Shaq doesn't forgive with words. He does it with truth. What started as an insult turned into the most unforgettable revenge they never saw coming. Because when Big Shaq moves in silence, empires fall loud. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It wasn't the kind of gym you'd see in downtown LA or Vegas. The floors creaked. The backboard on Court B had a crack in it shaped like lightning. But it smelled like fresh sweat, rubber soles, and cinnamon. Someone always brought donuts, no matter what day it was. And sitting cross-legged near the baseline, where scuffed lines met peeling paint, was Big Shaq. Not on a throne, not behind velvet rope, just sitting, hands tying the tiny shoelaces of a kid too shy to ask for help. The boy was no older than 8, quiet eyes, unsure grip on a ball that looked too big for him. Shaq leaned in, not towering, but lowering, voice low, calm, almost playful. Double knot. That's how you make sure the game don't stop halfway. The boy giggled, still looking down. Shaq tapped the toe of his sneaker. Go get him, lil' man. Around him, the gym hummed, not with admiration, but familiarity. The kind that forgot how many zeros were in your bank account. One girl tugged at Shaq's shirt to ask for seconds on pizza. Another slapped a foam ball at his back as she ran by, yelling, "You slow, big guy." And he took it all with that signature grin, wide enough to cover most of his face but soft enough to say, "I'm home here." To them, he wasn't the Hall of Famer. He wasn't the shoe line, or the ad deal, or the man whose face still showed up on sports highlight reels. He was just Shaq, the guy who remembered names, remembered birthdays, remembered who lost their mom last year, and showed up with flowers. He didn't talk much about the world outside these walls. Didn't bring up how stores still watched him too long, or how strangers still clutched purses tighter when he passed. The streets had changed, but not the lens, and yet he showed up. Every Saturday, every single one. Later that afternoon, the sun hit differently, slanting across the porch of a modest yellow house with 2 rocking chairs and a screen door that squeaked no matter how gently it was closed. Lucille sat in one of those chairs, lemonade glass foggy with condensation, a plate of sliced peaches balanced on her lap. Shaq slumped down in the other chair like a tree folding in on itself. "Long day?" she asked, not looking up. He shrugged. "Good day. Kids are getting fast though. Starting to outrun me." Lucille smirked. "They've been outrunning you, baby. You just now catching on." They both laughed low from the belly. A silence settled between them. Not the awkward kind, but the kind that only exists between people who've weathered storms together. Wind rustled the edges of the porch screen. Somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower buzzed lazily. Lucille finally looked over, eyes sharp under her Sunday hat. "You ever get tired of pretending it don't hurt?" Shaq blinked, didn't ask what she meant. He knew. That's how mothers talk. They skip over the surface and cut straight to the bruise. He took a long sip of lemonade. "It's not pretend, it's necessary." Lucille set her glass down, wiping the sweat from her neck with a folded napkin. "You think your silence keeps you safe? But baby, silence got its own weight. I see it in your shoulders." Shaq looked at his hands. They were massive, the kind of hands that could palm a basketball with no effort. But there were fine tremors sometimes, not from fear but from restraint, a life of learning how not to move too fast, not to speak too loudly, not to be the threat they already assumed he was. "I just want to help people," he finally said. "Be useful." "And you are," she said gently. "But being useful don't mean you gotta carry the world's blind spots. They don't see you right, Shaq. They see your size before your soul. And that don't change just 'cause you got money now." He didn't reply, just rocked slightly in the chair, back and forth, letting her words sink in like the creak of old wood. Lucille leaned closer. They still see you as too big, too black, too much. You know it. But the question is, do you still see yourself as enough?" That question hung in the air like smoke. The porch faded into golden hour, the kind where the sun throws long shadows, and everything feels a little more honest. A kid's bike clattered down the sidewalk. Somewhere, a dog barked twice, and stopped. Shaq stared at the horizon, where the sky tilted orange into soft indigo. "I don't think they hate me," he murmured. "I think they're scared of me. And when folks are scared, they try to shrink what they can't understand." Lucille nodded. lips pressed, and shrinking a giant that takes a lot of noise. Shaq smiled faintly. I've learned to listen past the noise. They sat like that for a while, rocking, breathing, watching day slowly slip into dusk. No cameras, no crowd, just a mother and her son, bruised by a world that praised him in public, but disrespected him in private. And yet, there was no bitterness in him. No anger, just this deep, quiet sadness that somehow made him even more human. He didn't carry the world's hate, he carried its confusion, and tried to love anyway. Later that evening, after Lucille had gone in to make dinner, Shaq stood outside on the porch. He pulled out his phone, scrolled through unread messages, and paused on one. A message from a name he hadn't seen in years. Colton Drexler. Big guy, we're opening the most exclusive casino in the Southwest next month. Would love to have you as the face of our launch. Red carpet, VIP only. It's gonna be epic. Call me, let's make history again. Shaq stared at the message. Colton was slick. The kind of man who wore fake humility like cologne. The kind who called you brother while checking the pockets of your success. They'd met a few times, enough for Shaq to know the type. Polished, performative, politically correct on paper, patronizing in person. He almost deleted the message. Almost. But something in him paused. Not curiosity. Not even vanity. Just a whisper of instinct. A ripple he couldn't quite explain. And he'd learned long ago when the air shifts like that, you don't ignore it. He tapped reply. Let me think about it. Might be in town. The send button clicked. The message vanished. And just like that, a gentle breeze stirred the porch curtains behind him. As if the world had inhaled quietly, preparing for something neither of them could see yet. Shaq looked out at the street again. Kids still played. The sky was darker now. But that old gym would still be there next week. That cracked backboard. That kid with loose shoelaces. Some places reminded you who you really were. Some people too. And sometimes, before the storm, the sky was quiet enough to hear the truth humming through it. Even for a gentle giant. He wants your face, Shaq. Your silence. Your gravity. Shaq leaned against the doorframe. Arms crossed. If I don't go, nothing changes. If I do, maybe I can push the needle. Lucille gave a small shake of her head. Just be sure you're not letting the devil borrow your shoes.
He didn't answer.
Just looked down at the invitation again. It was still gleaming in the kitchen light, daring him to ignore it. 3 days later, a private jet waited for him at Burbank. No logos, no reporters, just a single stewardess with a too-perfect smile and mirrored sunglasses. Her voice sweet and rehearsed. Mr. O'Neill, we're honored to have you aboard. He nodded politely, boarded and found the interior exactly what he expected. Leather so soft it felt like breath. A crystal decanter already filled, and music that sounded expensive but soulless. On the tray was a sleek black folder embossed with gold initials. C. Inside were mock-ups of the casino, floor plans, gala layouts, investment tiers. But it wasn't the photos that caught him. It was the careful placement of his own image. A silhouette of his figure standing beside the Dreamers Fund banner. No expression, no quote, just his presence used, like a signature. It made something shift in his stomach. The jet landed in Nevada just past sundown. A black SUV waited on the tarmac, engine already purring. As they drove toward the compound, the desert around them stretched dark and endless, broken only by the sudden rise of gold-tinted towers against the horizon. The casino itself was enormous, all glass curves and artificial waterfalls, lit up like a promise. Colton met him at the entrance, arms open like a long-lost brother. Shaq, the man, the myth, the miracle. His suit was navy silk, his smile, polished like armor. God, you look incredible. Come inside. Let me show you everything. Shaq allowed the handshake, nodded calmly, but said nothing. They walked through marble halls and soundproof lobbies. Colton's voice never stopped. Part salesman, part ringmaster. You wouldn't believe the traffic we're expecting. It's gonna make the strip look like a side road. And the fund, game changer. We've got some serious backers, even a couple senators interested in our community optics. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Community optics? Colton laughed. You know the good PR that comes with doing good things. It's a win-win. He stopped in front of a towering portrait that hadn't been there in the mock-ups. A stylized painting of Big Shaq, not smiling but regal. Below it, etched in steel, honorary ambassador of the Dreamers Fund. Shaq stared at it for a long beat. He hadn't agreed to that. Colton clapped a hand on his shoulder. It's powerful, right? No words needed. Your presence alone speaks volumes. And tomorrow night when you walk that carpet, people will know this place is built different. Inclusive, aspirational, real change. The words felt like perfume sprayed on garbage. Too strong, too artificial. They entered a lounge with soft jazz and rarefied air. A few men in sharp suits looked up, nodding respectfully. Colton poured 2 drinks without asking. I know what you're thinking, he said, handing over a glass. But this isn't just a casino. It's a movement. We're redefining luxury. People like us, people from where we came from, we weren't meant to build places like this. But here we are. Shaq swirled the drink but didn't sip. You're from Newark, Colton? Colton blinked, then grinned. Born and raised. Mama worked 3 jobs. Now I build empires. The American way, right? Shaq smiled. But it didn't reach his eyes. Funny. Last I heard your daddy was a hedge fund lawyer in Connecticut. Colton's laugh stuttered. Details. Story sells better when it's scrappy. Shaq stood. I'll see you tomorrow. Colton raised his glass. Make sure you rest up. Cameras love you, man. You light up a room. Shaq left the lounge, the hallway suddenly colder than he remembered. As he walked toward the elevator, his phone buzzed. A text from Shoni. Call me when you can. Miara saw a meme about you in some ad for a casino. She's confused. I'm not thrilled. He closed his eyes for a second, felt the headache settle between his brows. Back in his suite, vast, spotless and sterile, he took off his shoes, sat on the edge of the bed, and thought about Lucille's voice. Let the devil borrow your shoes. He glanced at the invitation again, now lying on the desk. The gold lettering still gleamed, unbothered. Somewhere deep down, something whispered. They're not inviting you to honor you. They're inviting you to use you. And suddenly, that perfect envelope didn't feel like an invitation. It felt like bait. The Echelon Mirage glittered like a palace stitched from neon dreams and silent ambition. From the highway, it rose out of the Nevada sand like something otherworldly. All glass spires and digital billboards, waterfalls that didn't touch the ground, and a sculpted gold lion roaring mid-leap at the entrance. Helicopters circled like curious birds, capturing the grandeur. Limousines pulled into a driveway wider than some highways, where a scarlet carpet ran like blood across marble steps. Shaq stepped out of the town car assigned to him, his own request, while others arrived in Rolls-Royces and Bentleys, paraded for the cameras, flashes popping like confetti. He wore a tailored black 3-piece suit, matte onyx tie, no jewelry, no brand name screaming. He didn't need noise to be noticed. His presence filled the space. Heads turned, phones angled up, yet something in the air was off. The eyes that looked weren't warm, they were calculated. A hostess approached, clipboard in hand, earpiece snug. Her smile flickered fast, reset like a glitch. Mr. O'Neill, welcome to Echelon Mirage. Please follow me to the pre-gala suite. Mr. Drexler will meet you shortly. She didn't walk beside him. She walked a step ahead, glancing back just enough to make sure he was following. As they moved through the grand atrium, high ceilings draped in gold thread banners, chandeliers that shifted shape with the music, Shaq noticed a quiet stiffness in the staff. Polite, precise, polished, but not present. Like actors in a play they hadn't written. He passed an art installation made entirely of poker chips suspended mid-air, frozen in a permanent explosion. A man in a white tux laughed too loudly. A famous pop star posed beside a slot machine shaped like a diamond. A congressman adjusted his bow tie and looked directly through Shaq. Then came the whisper, so quick and low he almost missed it. From a hallway security post, one staffer leaned toward another and said, "Keep an eye on him." Shaq's steps didn't slow. His expression didn't shift. He'd heard versions of that sentence his whole life, in stores, at airports, even in elevators. Always low enough to deny, always loud enough to wound. He let it pass, let it settle like ash, and kept walking. The pre-gala suite was less of a room, and more of a showroom for wealth. Velvet drapes pooled on mahogany floors, and a fleet of servers carried champagne flutes with pinched fingers. A digital fireplace flickered in a chrome frame. The air smelled of cedar and citrus, artificial and exact. It was beautiful and hollow. Colton arrived moments later, all showman energy wrapped in a silver suit that shimmered with the room's lighting. His hug landed with too much grip, too much ownership. Shaq, you made it. Damn. You clean up sharp, Colton said, holding the handshake a beat longer than necessary. Red carpet's already buzzing. We pushed your arrival so you'd hit peak coverage. Shaq smiled slightly. Careful. Didn't realize I was part of the programming. Con now, Colton chuckled, waving a hand. You're good for the optics. You know how this works. There it was. Said without flinch, without irony. A truth served cold. Before Shaq could respond, a woman in a silver dress stepped forward. Colton's PR director, Angela. She greeted Shaq with a photo-op smile and slipped a pin into his jacket pocket. Mini mic, she explained. The live feed tonight's gonna be tight, just in case you have any golden lines. I didn't plan on making a speech. Angela's smile didn't fade. You don't have to plan, sir. You just have to be seen. The room buzzed louder. A trio of celebrities walked in behind him, laughing too hard at nothing. Shaq moved to a corner, back to the wall, sipping mineral water from a glass too small for his hand. Every so often, someone approached him for a photo, a handshake, a fake laugh, a quick capture for their feed. No one asked how he was. No one mentioned the Dreamers Fund. They only mentioned how glad they were he showed up. Your presence means a lot. So important to have legends here. This place needed someone with your gravity. And each time Shaq nodded, smiled, played the game, while his insides hollowed, bit by bit. At 8:07 p.m., Colton signaled him to follow. Come on, showtime. They moved through a narrow corridor, velvet-lined, empty. Colton leaned close as they walked. This is how legacy gets written. Big man, the headlines tonight, they'll pair your name with generosity, luxury, vision. Everyone wants to be seen doing good, but when they see you here, they'll believe it. Shaq turned slightly. What if I want them to believe the good, not the gold? Colton grinned like a man who didn't hear the question. Same thing in this world. The main ballroom stretched across what felt like an entire city block. A spiraling chandelier spun like a galaxy overhead. Guests sat at glass tables shaped like cards. A raised runway cut through the center like a fashion show. Cameras panned from every angle. Shaq stepped into the light, and a wave of flashbulbs followed. He smiled, nodded, moved slow. Colton introduced him from the stage, voice booming, words like syrup. A man whose career redefined greatness. A heart bigger than any court. The perfect face for a cause we all believe in. Ladies and gentlemen, Big Shaq. Applause. But it wasn't thunderous. It was polite. Expected. The kind of clapping that ends the moment the cue light blinks off. Shaq stood under the spotlight, unsure what to do next. He hadn't written anything. No speech, no rehearsed anecdotes. Just instinct. He approached the mic but didn't speak. Looked around. Let the silence stretch just a second longer than was comfortable. Then said, "Glad to be here." That was all. The audience chuckled lightly. Colton raised his glass, pretending it was enough. But Shaq saw it. The wrinkle at the edge of his eye. The twitch in his lip. Control mattered to Colton. Shaq's silence interrupted that. After the stage, the room unraveled into cocktails and camera ops. Shaq drifted, eyes open, mouth mostly shut. He noticed the way staff kept glancing his way. The earpieces, the slight adjustments. One waiter lingered too long behind him. Another took a plate from his hand before he was finished. The smallest signs. But signs nonetheless. At one point he caught a sliver of conversation near a curtained corner. Two men, older suited, leaning in. He's a wild card. Looks good on the flyer, but don't let him get too close to the investors. Big money hates big shadows. Shaq stepped back before they noticed him, found the nearest exit, and took a long walk around the outdoor fountain. The desert air bit colder now, the water reflecting skyscrapers made of glass and gold. The entire place shimmered, but it didn't shine. Not really. It was a stage, and he was the set piece. His phone buzzed. A message from Mirage. "Saw you on TV. You look good. Be careful," he replied. Always. But even as he typed it, he knew. Something here wasn't right. Not just about him. Not just tonight. Something deeper. He turned and looked back at the building. Music boomed inside. The lion statue's mouth was wide open, mid-roar, lights dancing off its fangs. And for the first time that evening, Shaq felt small. Not because he didn't belong, but because he knew he did. and that terrified him more than anything. Shaq shifted his stance, standing tall. Their approach was smooth, not aggressive, not loud, but not polite either. One of them, the taller man with a shaved head, stopped a step too close. "Mr. O'Neill," he said in a tone that sounded rehearsed, "we're going to need you to step outside with us." Shaq stared. "Excuse me, there's been a dress code violation. The venue's private standards require formal black tie, and linen is considered non-compliant." Shaq didn't answer right away. He glanced around. People had noticed. Heads were tilting. Phones were subtly being raised. A few nearby guests froze mid-conversation. The music seemed to soften, though it had. "I'm wearing a tailored suit," Shaq said, voice steady. "Custom fit. No one mentioned black tie was mandatory." "It's in the guest agreement," the other guard added. "We understand this is uncomfortable, but we need to escort you out now. Please don't make this difficult." Shaq's mouth went dry. He looked past them across the ballroom and locked eyes with Colton. The man didn't flinch. He stood with a flute of something sparkling in his hand, smiling casually at a politician's joke. His glance at Shaq was so brief, so calculated, it made the whole thing sting sharper. He wasn't surprised. He was watching. Shaq took a breath, low and quiet. "You're telling me I'm not dressed well enough to be here?" "We're following protocol," the guard replied. "You can contact event management for clarification, but right now we're asking you to leave." No raised voices, no pushing, just quiet control disguised as decorum. Shaq felt every gaze on him now. Not the celebratory kind, not the "oh my god it's him" stares. These were different. Curious, cold, dissecting. His hands curled slightly at his sides, then relaxed. He said nothing. He nodded once, and walked. The guards flanked him, not touching, but close enough to remind him of the implication. The room parted, slowly, awkwardly. Some guests muttered things. Nothing clear, just fragments. "That's weird. Wait, what happened? Dress code? Seriously?" One woman whispered. Not so quietly. "I thought he was the face of this thing." Shaq kept walking, past the floor, past the gold trim, past the photo ops, and the velvet ropes, through the grand lobby, where a giant plasma wall still ran footage of his entrance earlier that night. Smiling, camera-friendly, welcomed like royalty. The irony burned. Outside, the air hit cold against his skin. Cameras followed. Photographers who didn't even know why they were filming now had footage they couldn't wait to sell. He stood beneath the glowing lion statue, once majestic, now mocking, and looked up at the flashing lights above the casino tower. The night swallowed him whole. No one from Colton's team followed. No PR rep. No explanation. No apology. Just silence. A black sedan idled by the curb. The driver, someone Shaq had never seen before, stepped out, opened the door without a word, and stood waiting. Shaq hesitated. His throat was tight. His chest felt split between heat and ice. But he said nothing, just lowered himself into the car, one deliberate move at a time. As the door closed behind him, the noise of the night vanished. The city lights blurred past the tinted windows. Shaq stared straight ahead, not blinking, not breathing hard, just burning, in the quietest, most dangerous way. They hadn't just insulted him. They had orchestrated it, crafted it, delivered it on a platter dressed as policy. They hadn't thrown him out in rage. They had dismissed him in calculation, with precision, and the world had watched. Some had cheered. Some had pitied. Most would forget by morning. But Shaq wouldn't, because this wasn't just about fabric. This was about position, about message, about a room that smiled in your face and erased you in the same breath. The car pulled onto the freeway. Lights slid across his face in intervals. He didn't check his phone, didn't call Lucille, didn't send a text to Shawnee. He sat in the silence and felt it, all of it, because to carry the pain is to know its weight, and to know its weight is to remember it when the time comes. Not for revenge, but for clarity. The morning after felt like waking up in a different world. The desert air of Nevada was replaced by the still calm of California's early light, filtering through high windows and landing across polished floors that reflected nothing back. Shaq sat at the kitchen island, elbows on the marble, palms pressed together like prayer hands. No TV, no music, no sound, just the occasional creak of a settling house, and the soft hum of a fridge that had nothing important to offer. He hadn't slept. Not really. He had dozed off on the plane back, not because he was tired, but because his body had done what his mind refused to shut down. A dreamless blackout. Now he was wide awake, mind sorting through what had happened, like scattered puzzle pieces, each edged in insult. His phone buzzed for the 7th time in 2 minutes. He let it ring. The world had moved quickly, as it always did. Clips of his exit from Echelon Mirage had already made the rounds. Some showed him being led out calmly. Others zoomed in on his face, parsing every micro-expression for outrage, confusion, shame, but it wasn't the footage that hurt. It was the commentary, on-screen anchors, fake concerned, dress code enforcement or discrimination. Bloggers, gleefully divisive. Shaq storms out of Vegas casino after misunderstanding. Pundits coded as ever. Shaquille O'Neal, while a beloved icon, may have misunderstood the tone of the event. Rules are rules. And worse, the social media parasites who fed on pain for clout. He wasn't even in black tie. Stop crying. Entitled much? Always playing the race card. Can't follow rules? Don't expect red carpets. Underneath it all was the real message. Polished, hidden, loud in its silence. They wanted to turn a calculated act of erasure into a narrative of overreaction, to make his composure seem petty, to turn quiet humiliation into a personal flaw. He scrolled for a moment longer, then turned the phone face down. The silence of the house cracked when the front door opened. Shawnee's voice, firm but familiar, called out, "You home?" He didn't answer, just exhaled. She walked in, purse over one shoulder, sunglasses in her hand. She wore no makeup, just clarity in her eyes, the kind she saved for moments when there was nothing left to sugarcoat. "Miora's upset," she said without sitting. She saw the clip on TikTok before I could stop it. Shaq nodded slowly. "She asked if they kicked you out because you were too big." Shawnee's voice broke slightly. She meant it literally, but I think she felt the other meaning too. He swallowed. Looked at the floor. "What'd you tell her?" "I told her you did nothing wrong. I told her sometimes people don't know what to do with strength. They can't control, especially when it walks in kindness." That made something move in his chest. Not break, not collapse, just shift. Like a foundation settling after an earthquake. Shawnee stepped closer, setting her phone on the counter. "But I didn't have an answer when she asked why you didn't say anything. Why didn't Daddy tell them he was important?" "That's what she said." "Did he forget?" Shaq let the question hang. He wasn't sure how to answer either. He hadn't forgotten who he was. He hadn't questioned his value, but something about the way they looked at him in that room, the way they executed their policy with surgical cruelty and public theater, had hit deeper than expected. He'd spent a lifetime learning how to take up less space. Not physically. That was impossible. But emotionally, socially, he knew how to lower his tone, keep his movements soft, stay out of the way until he was called upon to entertain, inspire, or endorse. And still, even after all that careful moderation, they had found a way to make him the problem. Shawnee poured herself a glass of water. Her movements clipped. "You gonna say something? To the press?" "No. To yourself." He looked at her. She didn't flinch. "I know what you want to do," she added. "I know your instinct. Take the high road. Ignore it. Be the bigger man. But maybe the bigger man stops letting people walk on his back just because he can carry the weight." He didn't speak. But his silence was no longer hollow. It was thick now, the beginning of something forming. Shawnee stepped away. "I just came to check on you. Mirage at my sister's for the day. If you need space, you've got it. If you need noise, I'm a phone call away." She was gone a moment later, the door closing softer than it had opened. Shaq sat there for another hour, still, thinking. He didn't want revenge. He didn't need to make a scene. But he needed the truth. His truth to be louder than the lies being written for him. He moved to the study, switched on the TV. A news panel debate had just begun. "This isn't about race," one panelist said. "It's about compliance. Everyone should be subject to the same rules." "Sure," another added. "But public figures also know how to turn moments into movements. Maybe Shaq's letting this blow out of proportion on purpose. For attention." Shaq stared at the screen, face unreadable. He didn't recognize the man speaking, but he recognized the tone. The comfort of those who had never been watched while shopping. The ease of people who had never been told to step aside, without explanation. the luxury of never having their dignity reduced to a headline. He reached for his phone again.
No press release. No.
Instead, he opened his contacts and scrolled. Not to celebrities, not to PR teams, to Tristan Vale, a journalist he trusted, and Jonas Creed, the quiet lawyer who specialized in discrimination cases no one wanted to touch. He sent both the same message. Need to talk. I'm not ready to go public. But I'm not letting this slide. He sat back. A different kind of silence settled over the room now. Not heavy. Focused. The cameras were quiet now. But that didn't mean the world wasn't watching. And this time, when they looked, they'd see all of him. The first was to Tristan Vale, a journalist with a voice like gravel, and eyes that never blinked when the story turned ugly. Tristan had once exposed a billion-dollar tech company for racial profiling, using its own diversity statement against them. He didn't chase clicks. He chased and he never missed. When Shaq's name flashed across his phone, Tristan picked up on the first ring. I've been waiting, he said before Shaq could speak. You saw what happened? I saw what they showed. What I want is what they didn't. Shaq leaned back in his chair. I'm not ready to go public, but I want to know what I'm up against. Tristan's voice dropped, intrigued. Then let's get surgical. The second call was harder to find. Harper Knox had gone underground 2 years back after a whistleblower report she filed against a global gaming consortium vanished under mysterious circumstances. She used to be one of the best systems engineers in the casino world, designing surveillance networks that didn't just watch, they listened. When she disappeared from Vegas, rumor was she'd taken a hard drive with her. Shaq reached her through a burner number, buried 3 contacts deep. The first voice on the line wasn't hers. It was a woman speaking code. When Harper finally came on, her tone was clipped. Did someone give you this number? I remembered it. You weren't supposed to. I remember things that matter. A pause. Talk. Shaq didn't bother with flattery or preamble. Echelon Mirage. What do you know? Another pause. This one longer, heavier. I know they've got tech in there that violates more than just privacy laws. I know their facial recognition isn't just for ID, it's for profiling. And I know Drexler's been trying to buy legitimacy since the day he faked his first partnership. Shaq nodded, already feeling the gears begin to shift. I need your help, he said. I don't do revenge. Neither do I. That silence was agreement. The third call was to Jonas Creed, a man whose voice rarely rose above a murmur, but whose court records read like war chronicles. Jonas was the kind of lawyer who didn't speak in metaphors. He spoke in statutes. He'd once forced a pharmaceutical giant to rewrite its hiring policy using one leaked memo and a single phrase, institutional exclusion. Jonas answered on the third ring, voice low. I saw the video. Everyone did. Shaq said, I don't want a lawsuit. I want the truth to outlive the lie. That's messier, Jonas replied, but more effective. Can you find the cracks? I already have.
The calls were short, intentional. Each player understood their role without needing a full playbook. That's the difference between amateurs and operators. Amateurs react, operators prepare.
Within 48 hours, Harper sent over a package, digital files routed through 3 proxies, labeled like vacation photos. Inside were the blueprints for the Echelon Mirage surveillance system. Not just camera layouts, behavioral tracking protocols, algorithm triggers, anomaly alert tags, and facial recognition software that, when decoded, showed preferential tracking based on skin tone, dress, and even posture. One flagged profile description chilled Shaq to the bone. Large African-American male. High visibility, watch pattern, proximity to high-value guests. They hadn't just removed him for his clothes. They'd labeled him a risk from the moment he walked through the door. He forwarded the files to Jonas and Tristan simultaneously. Tristan called within 10 minutes. This isn't just bias, he said, voice electric with focus. This is a system. You were just the wrong man in the right suit at the wrong time. Prove it, Shaq said. Oh, I will. But we need a piece they don't know exists. Something only you can get. Shaq raised an eyebrow. Like what? A second look from inside. That's when the idea began to form. Not loud, not showy, but clean, strategic. Harper helped design a persona, fake ID, background, even a custom wardrobe fitted to make Shaq look like someone else. Not a celebrity, not a sports legend, just a high-stakes player from New Mexico, with old money and a hobby for cards. They called him Malcolm Steele. Jonas made sure the paperwork passed any sniff test. Tristan crafted a narrative shell that looked like a puff piece on anonymous whales in the gaming industry. And Shaq? He disappeared. For 2 weeks he left the public eye. No events. No appearances. Just the quiet construction of a plan too quiet to be noticed. Then one night, Malcolm Steele entered Echelon Mirage through the East Wing entrance, the one reserved for VIPs flown in via private charter. He wore a charcoal gray suit, hair shaved low, glasses with a light tint. The beard was gone. The swagger muted, just enough change to make people squint and doubt, then dismiss. He played light at first. A few hands of blackjack, light conversation. Kept his voice soft. Observed the staff. Noted the patterns. He was scanned like everyone else. Watched. Lost. But unlike last time, he was welcomed. Treated like money. Because this time, they didn't see Shaquille O'Neal. They saw a man with no baggage, no headlines, no weight attached. Malcolm Steele was invisible. And that made him dangerous. Over the next 3 nights, Shaq watched everything. Not just the tables, but the treatment. He watched 3 young black men be escorted off the floor without incident. Watched a Latin woman be denied access to a high roller room, despite wearing credentials. Watched how the cameras shifted when certain guests walked by. Watched how the dealers hesitated, just slightly when the player wasn't white. He recorded it all. Micro behaviors, inconsistencies, patterns. By the time the week ended, Tristan had enough material to draft the bones of an exposé. Jonas had prepped a civil suit that could be triggered the moment the story hit. Harper had created a backdoor kill switch for any internal server crash attempts. But Shaq wasn't ready yet. Because this wasn't checkers. It was chess. And he hadn't moved his queen. Not yet. He stood in front of the mirror that night. Back in his own face again. Looking at the man beneath the legend. The one they tried to shrink. He adjusted his collar. Straightened his spine. The last move was coming. And when it did, no one would see it. For what it was. Until the board was empty. Malcolm Steele didn't walk into Echelon Mirage like a man seeking revenge. He walked in like a man who'd always belonged there. No fanfare, no entourage, no whispers following behind him. He stepped out of the private transport with a briefcase in one hand and a matte black card in the other, handed it to the concierge without looking, and was escorted through a side entrance where the real players were welcomed, not the influencers, not the celebrity. The ghosts who moved money without leaving footprints. Shaquille O'Neal was gone. What walked into the casino that night was something smoother, quieter, sharper. The beard was gone. The build was impossible to hide, but the posture was different. Tighter shoulders, a confident slouch. The voice, when he used it, was slower, deeper, with a controlled rasp that threw off even the most attentive observers. Harper had trained him in movement, rhythm, pacing. Tristan had fed him a cover story that passed every test. Jonas had tightened the alias into something bulletproof. Malcolm Steele wasn't a lie. He was a role that fit too well. Inside the Mirage, the lights pulsed cooler than last time. The neon softened, the music low and thumping like a heartbeat you could feel through the marble. Shaq moved through the floor like smoke. No one flinched. No security glances. No coded whispers. He was money now, and money walked wherever it wanted. At the high-limit table, the dealers greeted him with smiles rehearsed in mirrors. He slid into a chair with a fluid motion, his body filling the space with quiet dominance. No one questioned his seat. No one checked his ID again. He dropped a few chips, played slow, calculated hands, never winning too much, never losing too fast. His moves were intentional. He wasn't there for the thrill. He was there to see the room, to feel who it flexed for, and who it folded against. Within the first 30 minutes he caught his first pattern. A black man in a plum suit sat down 2 tables away, laughing too hard, trying to relax. Shaq watched the way the dealer dealt to him, slower than normal, eyes flicking sideways after each round. The man won twice, and both times a floor manager drifted nearby, chatting with the pit boss, not watching anyone else. 10 minutes later the man was quietly pulled aside and didn't return. Shaq kept playing. Another hour, another example. This time it was a woman. Elegant, mid-40s, pearls, confidence. Latina. She asked for chips at a mid-stakes table. Shaq caught the way her ID was double-checked while 2 white players next to her slid theirs across with no delay. The dealer gave a tight smile, a small nod. She never looked relaxed again. Everything was subtle, but Shaq saw it all. That was the gift of being ignored when you wore the right mask. They assumed you were one of them, so they acted natural, which meant they showed their real faces. Malcolm Steele became a regular over the next week. He wasn't loud, he didn't win big, but he tipped well, asked the right questions, and spent just enough to earn loyalty. The staff treated him like a made man. The guests didn't ask questions. The cameras didn't flag him. He was the ghost in the casino, slipping between surveillance gaps that Harper had mapped with surgical precision. He carried a watch, Harper modified. It looked like a sleek Patek Philippe, but inside was a rolling cam lens that rotated angles every 5 minutes. He recorded tables, conversations, behavior, even small gestures, like how one staffer always leaned closer when talking to Asian women, but took a full step back with black guests. Every night, he sent encrypted drops to Harper and Tristan. Every drop was a needle. By the end of day 5, they had a stack of visual data too large to explain away. Tristan called it the soft science of racism. Shaq called it truth. By day 6, he knew the Mirage inside and out. He had mapped the entry paths, the unmarked elevators, the employee bathrooms where managers made quiet calls. He had counted how many black employees worked on the main floor. 3. How many were behind the scenes, uncountable, and how often the ratio changed depending on the hour or the clientele. He began to push just a little harder. Asked questions about the Dreamers Fund. Wanted to give big. The marketing director, a man named Felix Wren, with too much gel and not enough eye contact, fed him polished nonsense. "It's still ramping up," Felix said. "We've got an announcement coming soon. You know how these optics are." Shaq didn't blink. "I like transparency. Don't like putting my name behind ghosts." Felix laughed nervously. "Of course. We'll keep you in the loop." That was the second time he said optics in under 2 minutes. That night, Shaq visited the executive lounge, reserved for whales and board members. It was quieter there, less glitz, more control. He ordered sparkling water, sat near the corner, and listened. 2 men at a table behind him were talking. "Heard they got heat from that whole O'Neill thing. Colton doesn't care." He flipped it to his favor. "Said it proves we don't bend the rules for fame." Chris bought it? They bought enough. The real story's locked tight. Shaq let the words register, then pressed his cuff. One of Harper's triggers. Audio locked. Uploading. Stored. Later that night, he returned to his room. The Mirage gave Malcolm Steele a suite on the upper floors. Sharp, white, pristine. He walked to the window and looked out across the desert. Then he opened a secure laptop. Tristan was already live on the other side. Jonas joined seconds later. Harper's face flickered and laughed. "We have what we need," Harper said. "Audio, visual, patterns, evidence of discrimination. But the real bomb?" She pulled up a file marked VR AI Orvat. "What is that?" Shaq asked. "Proof that their surveillance AI isn't just tracking behaviors. It's actively flagging based on skin tone probability. They're teaching the system to see color, and using it to remove people before they create risk, even if no policy's broken." Jonas exhaled. "You release this, it's not just a scandal. It's federal. It's systemic." Shaq leaned forward. "We don't just release it, we time it." Tristan grinned. "Then you'll love this. Colton just announced a gala next week. Full press, fund reveal, high-profile guests. It's their crown jewel." Shaq smiled for the first time that day. "Then we wait," he said. The ghost in the casino was about to make himself visible. And when he did, they'd remember what happens when you bet against a man who sees the whole board. It came on a Tuesday night, cloaked in silence. The kind of silence that doesn't soothe but warns. Shaq sat alone in the corner of his temporary suite, under the identity of Malcolm Steele, dressed in shadow and sweatpants, eyes trained on the screen of an encrypted laptop Harper had given him, the kind that couldn't be hacked, tracked, or casually ignored. The files arrived like a pulse of static in his inbox, encoded behind 3 layers of keys. Harper's message was short. "You said you wanted the truth. Here's what they buried under gold." He opened the first folder marked DF Internal. Dreamers Fund documents, allegedly the reason he'd been invited to the gala in the first place. On the surface, the fund looked legitimate. Celebrity endorsements, vague mission statements, photo ops with city leaders, and school kids. But within Harper's leak were internal memos, budget routing diagrams, and shell company links that turned his stomach. The donations never reached the schools. Not one. Every wire transfer made in the name of youth support funneled through a hedge-managed trust called Helix Growth Partners, registered in the Cayman Islands, co-owned by a subsidiary under Colton Drexler's former campaign finance director. The money, millions in charitable pledges, was never spent. It was cycled, scrubbed, hidden. The Dreamers Fund was a stage prop, a moral alibi for a criminal machine dressed in philanthropy. Shaq exhaled through his nose, heavy, jaw tight. He clicked on a second file labeled Application Review Logs. There, in spreadsheet after spreadsheet, were names. Applicants for educational grants, mentorship programs, startup seed funding. But color-coded next to each name were strange notations, not just scores or qualifications, but tab. One column, hidden behind a function Harper had decrypted, revealed a pattern, tags like URM, low image ROI, high visibility, potential brand misalignment, accent noticed, recommend soft rejection. Minority applicants, Black, Latinx, immigrant background, were being filtered not by need or merit, but by perception. Public image risk. They were seen as noise, not narrative. Names were denied not because they lacked potential, but because they didn't photograph well next to polished lobby banners and Colton's whitewashed vision of progress. Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, fists on his knees. The third file was audio. Just one. Labeled, Boardroom March 17 Full Duet. He clicked play. The static cleared, and a conversation bloomed. 5 voices, each distinct, each confident. Colton's was the loudest, smooth and punchy, mid-sentence and mid-laugh. I mean, come on. We couldn't buy this kind of PR, if we tried. You saw the look on his face, right? Like someone took his crown away. But that's the trick. Don't come to the palace if you don't read the dress code. Another man laughed. He walked out like a puppy. Didn't even bark. A third voice cut in. It's optics, gentlemen. Always optics. Shaquille O'Neal's presence was good for headlines. His absence is better for control. Colton again. Exactly. You give them a stage. They start thinking they own the theater. Sometimes you gotta remind the big man he's still just a player. We let him in because he's lovable. But lovable doesn't mean equal. Shaq didn't breathe. He sat frozen, listening to men in $1,000 suits slice him down in real time. Another voice chimed in. So what about the backlash? Colton chuckled. Let it come. It blows over. As long as the brand survives, who cares who feels slighted? You think anyone's pulling out because a basketball legend felt disrespected? Please, by next month, he'll be back on a reality show, and we'll be cutting ribbon on our next location. There was a clink of glasses. A toast. To vision, one said. To silence, another replied. The recording ended. Shaq leaned forward, hands on the desk, knuckles white. He didn't feel embarrassed. He didn't feel he felt clarity. This was never about a dress code. This wasn't about an outfit or a misunderstanding, or misplaced security policies. This was systemic. It was deliberate. They hadn't removed him for how he looked. They removed him because his presence contradicted their lie. He didn't fit the mold. He didn't shrink when told. He didn't bow when used. He turned to another folder. Harper had labeled Eyes Only. Inside were floor schematics of Echelon Mirage, but not the public ones. These showed hidden rooms, off-grid surveillance hubs, and 2 executive-level observation suites, with direct audio-visual feeds from the casino floor, AI behavior logs, racial metrics, VIP guest prioritization mapping. There was a room suite 43R, buried behind what looked like a janitorial corridor. No signage, no listed access, but logged under the property registry as a media observation node. It was soundproof, 2-way glass, hooked into the live AI feed, and more importantly, every second inside was recorded. That was the trapdoor. Not in the law. Not in the headlines. In the building itself. Shaq paced the room, each step heavier than the last. His mind didn't race. It calculated. He wasn't going to release a press statement. He wasn't going to ask for an apology. He wasn't going to make noise. He was going to open the rotten core. From the inside. He called Jonas first. I need a subpoena plan ready, Shaq said. But don't serve it yet. Just prep it. You found something. I found everything. And I want to make sure it detonates when they're watching. Then he dialed Tristan. We're going live soon, the journalist said. I've got national editors on standby. Not yet. Shaq said. I want to add one last piece. Tristan paused. What are you thinking? I want their truth. The one they thought was hidden. In their words. In their data. In their building. And I want the world to see it as it's happening. Not after. Not recapped. Live. Tristan's voice lit with fire. Let's burn the mask. Shaq hung up and sent one more encrypted message to Harper. I need the eye in the room. Suite 43R. Tell me what they see and when. The reply came in 2 words. Already watching. That night, Shaq didn't sleep. He paced. He reviewed the files again. Every audio bite. Every flagged applicant. Every racial metric, embedded in a spreadsheet, sold as guest enhancement. Colton Drexler had crafted an empire on top of a rotten lie. One that exploited the language of progress while rejecting the people it was supposedly meant to uplift. And he'd thought it would last because no one was watching closely enough. Because his victims were always too tired. Too silenced. Too alone. But this time, he picked the wrong man to push out the door. Shaq closed the laptop. He looked at his reflection in the window. A silhouette against the night. No smile, no act. He wasn't just angry. He was ready. Not to shout. Not to fight. But to expose. Because you don't have to swing when you're holding the floor beneath their feet. The marquee outside Echelon, Mirage, shimmered like it had been carved from champagne light. Massive gold letters announced the evening's spectacle. Dreamers Fund Gala. A night of legacy. Beneath it, red velvet ropes stretched along the main entrance, framing a path that looked more like a coronation than a fundraiser. Spotlights crisscrossed the sky like celestial swords, and a string quartet played orchestral covers of pop anthems, their music weaving through the hum of luxury sedans and stepped-out limos. Cameras lined both sides of the carpet. Influencers with earpieces rehearsed their lines into phones, adjusting their gowns. Photographers called out names rapid-fire. The guests, Hollywood adjacent, politics polished, and finance glossed, arrived with careful timing. Tonight wasn't about being seen. It was about being seen correctly. Inside, the ballroom was dressed like royalty. Crystal trees dripping with lights dotted the perimeter. Gold-plated tables shimmered beneath soft ceiling fixtures shaped like halos. In the center stood a stage framed by 2 LED panels that played looped footage of smiling children, classroom chalkboards, and Colton Drexler shaking hands with city officials. He stood backstage now, suit perfect, tie like a blade, teeth gleaming. Press is live in 6 markets. His assistant whispered. Governors expected in 30. We're tracking 3 cable networks running your keynote live. Colton exhaled like a man preparing for applause. Good. Let's make sure the legend sells better than the facts. Meanwhile, across the carpet, a different arrival slipped into the stream of flashes. No security entourage, no PR handler, just not Malcolm Steele.
Not the curated image from a flyer.
Just Shaquille O'Neal. Black suit, crisp collar, open neckline, clean face, no smile. He didn't glide in. He walked with intention, measured steps that cut through the noise like a slow beat in a room, addicted to fast tempos. He didn't pose for cameras. He didn't wave. He didn't have to. The press recognized him immediately, like gravity walking through a planet. Shaq. Mr. O'Neal, can we... Sir, are you back to support Colton Drexler? He didn't answer, just passed through the noise like a storm cloud dressed in velvet. Inside, a few heads turned as he entered the ballroom. Conversations didn't stop, but they shifted. Some paused mid-sip. Some narrowed eyes. Others offered those brittle, too smooth smiles, the kind reserved for surprises people pretend they expected. And he wasn't alone. Harper stood near the soundboard, her hair tucked into a sleek bun, badge clipped with a fake title, Event Systems Consultant. She looked like she belonged there, because she made herself invisible the same way code slips through firewalls. Elegantly, Tristan Vale leaned against a back column, half lit by chandelier glow, sipping soda from a rocks glass like it was whiskey, dressed like a quiet donor. Earpiece in, recorder live, watching the currents. Jonas Creed, in a 3-button dark navy suit, moved through the tables like a legal shadow. He shook hands with 2 judges, kissed the cheek of a senator's wife. Nobody asked him why he was there. And Lucille? She was watching from home. Sitting on her floral couch in the house, Shaq bought her 15 years ago. A bowl of peach slices beside her, TV volume low, eyes locked. When the camera cut to Shaq's entrance, she smiled once. Not proud, not impressed, Just ready. Because she knew her son wasn't walking into a gala. He was walking into a closing act. Colton appeared on stage 30 minutes in. The room dimmed. Spotlights pooled around his figure as soft string music faded under his voice. Good evening, friends. Tonight isn't just about the future. It's about those who dared to dream beyond the past. The Dreamers Fund isn't just a charity, it's a movement. One that connects legacy to opportunity.
Applause.
Polished. Predictable. He spoke for 10 minutes. He dropped words like equity, access, community. Each one slid off his tongue like branding. Not belief. Then came the punchline. Tonight we're honored to welcome a legend. A man whose stature is only exceeded by his generosity. Please welcome Shaquille O'Neal. The room pivoted toward Shaq as the spotlight found him. He stood, but he didn't walk fast. He walked slow. Every step landing like punctuation on a sentence no one realized was being written. He didn't shake Colton's hand. Didn't bow his head. Just turned to the crowd. Took the mic. Let the silence breathe. I was invited here to speak about dreams. He said, voice even, deep. But I'm gonna speak about masks. Eyes shifted. Forks paused. Some laughs coughed into silence. Shaq continued. Sometimes a dream is just a lie that costs more. Sometimes a fund is just a pocket wearing a halo. He turned toward the projection behind him. An image of smiling kids in after-school programs. This image saved someone a lot of money. The screens flickered, then changed. One by one, Harper's prepared files began to play. Surveillance logs. Redacted applicant lists showing rejections tagged by race. Audio. Colton's voice. You give them a stage. They start thinking they own the theater. Gasps in the crowd. One woman's wine glass tipped over. Chairs shifted. Jonas stood up from his table, handed a document to a state rep sitting 3 seats down. Courtesy of civil code violations. Enjoy your reading. Tristan stepped away from the wall. Phone raised. Live stream already viral. Colton rushed the mic. Pale. This isn't sanctioned. Shaq, whatever stunt. Shaq didn't flinch. Don't worry. You'll get your spotlight. The feed cut to Colton's private room logs. Facial recognition programming. AI filters. Lovable doesn't mean equal. Security froze. Staff looked to management. No one moved. Because nobody knew what to do when the man they'd tried to erase walked back in, holding the floorboards to the Empire. Shaq looked over the stunned crowd once more. I came here because I thought this place stood for something. Turns out, it does. Just not what it claims. He stepped back, laid the mic down, and walked off stage. No music. No applause. Just the sound of 1,000 masks cracking all at once. You give them a stage, they start thinking they own the theater. Sometimes you gotta remind the big man, he's still just a player. Gasps. A few stunned guests pushed back from their tables. One woman in a blue gown whispered, "Is this real?" to no one in particular. Shaq stepped slowly up the stairs, onto the stage. The room was silent now, not from shock, but awe. He didn't grab the mic. He didn't tower over Colton. He stood beside him.
You kicked me out for my clothes,
Shaq said, voice low, clear. But the truth is, it wasn't what I was wearing. It was what I represented. Colton tried to pivot, reaching for narrative. You don't understand the logistics. There's protocol, rules, appearances to uphold. Shaq turned, calm. And when those rules only apply to the people who make you uncomfortable, they're not rules. They're shields for cowardice. No one clapped. Not yet. It wasn't time. The moment was still descending. I didn't come here to make a scene, Shaq continued. I came because I thought maybe this place meant what it said about equity, about legacy, about dreaming forward. But what I saw was a house built on mirrors, where the people cleaning the floors get watched harder than the people counting the money. He paused. Where being black is a profile, not a person. That line cracked the air open. One man near the bar coughed hard, looking around like he wanted an exit that wasn't there. Someone dropped a wine glass. The footage on screen shifted again. Harper's data analysis, racial breakdowns of staff distribution, rejection rates by ethnicity, AI algorithm bias overlays. Shaq let it run behind him as he spoke. You say this place is for dreamers, but you built it like a trap. You made people believe they mattered, until it was inconvenient. He took one slow step toward Colton. You thought I'd stay quiet. Smile, take the insult and keep selling your lie. But I don't play that game anymore. Then, turning to the audience, Shaq raised his voice, not in volume, but in presence. I came here tonight with receipts, not for sympathy, for accountability. Every document, every clip, every whispered slur that got buried under policy. It's all real, and it's all public. At the back of the ballroom, a small team of Tristan's assistants uploaded the entire package onto a live server. Reporters' phones buzzed one by one. The truth had gone global. Colton's face had drained of color. This isn't the end, he snapped, voice shaking now. You think this ruins me? I'll rebuild. No, Shaq said flatly. You won't, because your empire was built on silence, and now the silence is over. A beat passed. Then someone stood. A man near the front. Slow, stunned, and clapped. Once, twice. Others followed. Not thunderous, not immediate, but real. A slow, stunned applause rolled through the room, like a rising tide. Not a celebration, but a reckoning. Shaq didn't bow. He didn't smile. He just stepped off stage, passed through the same aisle where he'd once been watched with suspicion, now walked with respect. The kind that isn't loud, but earned. Backstage, Jonas waited. Already on the phone with legal, Harper nodded once from the tech booth. Tristan walked behind, documenting everything in real time. As Shaq exited the ballroom, a reporter reached for a question. He stopped, turned. Final statement? She asked, breathless. He looked into the camera, steady. You don't have to scream to change the room, he said. You just have to tell the truth loud enough to echo. Then he walked into the night, the weight of his silence replaced with something sharper.
Purpose.
It didn't take a week. By the time the sun rose, the morning after the gala, the story had already reached every major outlet in the country. Not as a passing segment, not buried beneath politics or celebrity gossip, but front page, banner headline, multi-column bold. Echelon Mirage implodes, surveillance bias, charity fraud, and the voice that broke it all. Shaq didn't speak to the cameras waiting outside the casino. He didn't hold a press conference. He didn't post a single tweet. He sat in the back of a black SUV, windows tinted, arms folded quietly, as the chaos he had never needed to scream for began unraveling the empire that once tried to strip him down to just an image. Within 48 hours, state regulators launched a formal investigation. The Nevada Gaming Control Board suspended Echelon Mirage's operating license, pending a full audit. The footage revealed in the gala's bombshell projection was reviewed, verified, and deemed admissible. Overnight, tables stopped spinning, rooms emptied, bookings collapsed, and Colton Drexler vanished. His penthouse suite was cleared by staff who'd been instructed not to speak to press. His social media accounts were wiped. His assistant resigned within the day. Rumors swirled, private jet sightings in Panama, a hidden estate in Portugal. But no one could confirm his location. What they could confirm was the silence from his investors. The same brands that once flashed beside Colton's smug grin in magazine spreads. Watches, cars, venture tech began issuing statements within hours. We are re-evaluating our partnership. We stand against all forms of discrimination. Echelon Mirage no longer reflects our values. Within a week, the sponsor wall inside the casino's main lobby, once covered in luxury logos and smiling plaques, was bare. Shaq watched it all unfold quietly. He didn't gloat, didn't smile. He'd said everything that needed to be said, the moment he laid the truth bare in front of the same crowd that had once politely watched him be escorted out. Now the crowd was watching the stage collapse, not from fire, not from fury, but from the slow suffocation of truth that had waited just long enough to speak. Harper Knox was the first to go public. Not with a tell-all, but with clarity. She released a full technical report titled, The Mirage Algorithm, a 72-page breakdown of how surveillance AI had been weaponized under the guise of luxury service and operational security. The report was downloaded over 500,000 times in the first 4. Multiple universities asked to use it in ethics curriculums. Journalists called it the most detailed domestic expose on algorithmic bias ever recorded. A week later, Harper signed a publishing deal. Her book was announced the same day. She declined interviews, said she wasn't chasing attention. Just correction. Jonas Creed filed the civil suit 3 days after the board hearings began. The class action quickly gained traction, not just from patrons who had been profiled and removed, but from former employees who had endured years of coded racism, professional sabotage, and silencing under non-disclosure agreements crafted by Drexler's legal team. Jonas never raised his voice either. He let the evidence do it for him. When Tristan Vale's piece dropped in the Atlantic, it shattered online traffic records, titled "The House Always Wins Until It's Watched." The article was more than a report. It was a narrative, a reckoning. It documented not only the events but the systems behind them. How institutions dress discrimination in gold. How power smiles as it extracts. How silence becomes strategy. The piece was nominated for a Pulitzer before the month was over. And Shaq, he didn't take interviews, he didn't accept the late-night show invites or the glossy magazine features that followed. He went back to the same community gym, where the basketballs still thudded against cracked floors, where pizza was still passed around on paper plates, where a little boy asked if his shoelaces were tight enough before sprinting back onto the court. He stood at the back of the gym that first Saturday, arms crossed, watching the same kids who didn't care how many headlines he was part of, just that he was there, still here, still their giant. Lucille was sitting on the bleachers, reading her paper when a reporter finally caught up to Shaq in the parking lot. Not a camera crew. Just one woman, young, nervous, respectful. "Mr. O'Neill," she said softly, "is there anything you'd like to say, now that everything's out in the open?" He looked at her, not annoyed, not proud, just thoughtful. He took a breath, then said, "I didn't do it to win. I did it so the next kid doesn't have to explain why he got walked out a door he paid to walk through." She nodded, recording off. He walked back inside.
No press followed.
They didn't need to. The story had already echoed further than anyone expected. Back at Echelon Mirage, the luxury was still there. Chandeliers, velvet floors, chrome elevators, but the silence inside was different now. Empty. The kind of silence that follows when money retreats, when the illusion is cracked too deep to buff out. The Dreamers Fund was dissolved. Every dollar was accounted for. Every applicant who had been flagged for low image ROI received a personal letter of apology, a public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, and access to new grants sponsored by an independent board, not because of guilt, but because of pressure. The world had changed. Slightly. But meaningfully. Not because a system had collapsed entirely, but because it had been witnessed. And Shaq? He walked through the Mirage one last time. Not as Malcolm Steele, not as an honored guest, just as himself. Same door, same hall. No fanfare, no flashing lights. He passed through the space like a man walking out of a past that never fit right. A chapter closed, not with a bang, but with peace. At the exit, a young staffer, barely 20 maybe, looked up from the podium, recognition in his face. He didn't speak at first, just handed Shaq a folded card. He opened it later, in the back seat of a car. "Thanks for showing us how to win without shouting." No name. Didn't need one. Some things echo longer when they're signed in quiet. Because change, real change, doesn't scream in headlines. It grows in silence. And this gym, this dusty, beautiful little gym, was full of it. In the bleachers, Lucille sat with a paper cup of coffee between her hands, watching her son the way only a mother could. There was pride in her eyes. Yes. But also peace. The kind that only comes when you've watched someone you love choose dignity, when fury would have been easier. Shaq stood and stretched, his back cracking like old floorboards. Mira spotted him from across the court, ran through a cluster of kids, and wrapped her arms around his waist. "Daddy," she said into his chest. "Hey, baby girl. I saw the article in the magazine at school," she mumbled. "You were in it. It said you changed things." He smiled. "I didn't change anything. I just pointed a light where they didn't want it." She looked up at him, serious now. But they listened. He paused. "No," he said softly. "They watched. That's all I needed." They stood like that for a few seconds longer before Mira was called back to help coach a scrimmage. She left with a grin, her braids swinging behind her like a banner of joy. Shaq returned to the bench, pulled a towel from his bag, wiped his forehead, then sat and simply exhaled. This was what peace looked like, not quiet but real. Not perfect but true. A kid older this time, maybe 10, wandered over holding a basketball against his hip. He sat on the floor beside Shaq, shy but curious. "Mr. Shaq?" he asked. "Yeah, lil man. You ever gamble?" Shaq chuckled, looked at the ceiling like the question had come from somewhere divine. "Only," he said, eyes returning to the boy, "when I know I'm holding the truth." The kid nodded, as if that made perfect sense, and returned to the game. Just like that. No follow-up. No disbelief. Just understanding. Sometimes kids know what grown folks pretend to forget. Across the gym, Lucille raised her cup in a small toast. Shaq raised his bottle of water back. In that moment, the weight of it all, the insult, the exposure, the empire that collapsed, felt far away. Not erased, not forgotten. Finished. Shaq leaned back against the wall and let the sounds of the gym fill the space inside him that used to burn. A buzzer went off. Someone shouted, "Pick and roll." Another kid tripped and laughed before they even hit the ground. And Shaq? He just was. Whole, quiet, watching a better world trying its best to grow. Voiceover. As if spoken in memory, not for effect. Sometimes life insults you loud. Real loud. Like it's trying to make you believe you're less. Smaller. Forgettable. But your answer? Your answer doesn't have to match its volume. It doesn't have to be loud. It just has to be lasting. That's how you make it echo. Not every giant roars. Some just shift the room by standing still. If this story stirred something in you, don't scroll past it. Share it. Speak on it. Sit with it. The next time someone gets pushed out quietly, let this remind you silence doesn't mean surrender. Sometimes it's just the calm before the correction.